Hello, everyone who's joining us. I'm just waiting a few more minutes. It's 2 minutes to 12, so we'll kick off in a couple of minutes and do introductions and get going with the session. But it's lovely to see all of you here. We'll just wait a minute or two for more people to join. It's just gone 12 o'clock. Welcome, everyone, to our live Global Sustainability Live discussion, question and answer session. It's so good to see all of you, to see you face to face after having been with you in the discussions and the online chat. I'm Deanna Meth, I'm your moderator on this module, and we're also excited to have two guest speakers with us today to enhance our thinking for the upcoming conversations that we'll have today and in the next couple of weeks in the remaining time for this course. Before we do a round of introductions to everybody, I really would like to start this session with a formal acknowledgement of country. At QUT, we acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands, Meanjin, Brisbane. These are lands that have never been ceded, and we pay respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. I know that everybody's not from Brisbane, and we have people from around Australia and beyond Australia. So I really would also like to acknowledge the First Nations owners of the lands wherever you are based. Given the nature of our discussions as well in sustainability, I would also particularly like to acknowledge the central role played by First Nations peoples in caring for country, culture, and community. And we've all learned in this course just how much work and knowledge this encompasses. And we still have much to learn from one another. And last, by no means least, in Australia this week, you may know that it is also National Reconciliation Week. And this is a time for us all to explore how we can contribute together to reconciliation in Australia. This year's theme, now more than ever, is an encouragement for all of us to collectively advance towards a reconciled future. In terms of today's session format, it's wonderful. I can see we've got 24 participants here who've joined us, so that's fantastic. We'll start with a very quick round of introductions, and then we'll move to the short presentations from our two keynote speakers, and then we'll open up a wider discussion to the group. But feel free to pop any thoughts or questions that you might have in the chat as we go along. If you're able to turn on your camera, that'll be great. But if you don't want to, or you're eating your lunch, it's absolutely no problem. Or you might be eating your breakfast or your dinner, depending where you're zooming from. And you can keep your microphone on mute unless you're actually asking a question in the second half. It's really been so good getting to know all of you in the group. There's such a diverse set of nationalities, languages, levels of study, interests, working professions. A lot of you are experts in your own field. And this has led to a really rich set of comments and discussions across the weeks so far. I think because we're a small group, let's all just briefly say what our name is and also maybe just say one thing that you're interested in with sustainability, and to avoid the chaos of knowing who's spoken and who hasn't. If everybody could just raise their hand now, I'll raise my hand. If you could just raise your hand, and then I'll call out your name. And as I call out your name, you can introduce yourself. If you don't want to speak, Katrina, I know you've got issues. Feel free to just pop something in the chat. All hands raised. Okay, Robert, you're first on my screen. Would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, everyone. I'm Robert White. I'm definitely interested in sustainability from a personal level through to anything else I have influence on.
Great. Thanks, Robert. You can lower your hand. Jackie, you're next.
Thanks, Deanna. Jackie Croak here, currently the director of the QUT Resilience Centre. My personal interest in sustainability is around water security and water availability.
Great, thank you. Jessica.
Hi there, my name's Jess. I work in the venues and events team at QUT on Gardens Point campus. So sustainability, we are looking at trying to make new ways of rolling sustainability out through across all of our venues in the industry, as well as personal note. I've got 3 kids, so we try and go to clothes swaps and do sustainable things to kind of educate them on how they can contribute to a better world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jessica. Stanley?
Hi, everyone. I'm a senior lecturer in the accounting school. And in our school, we actually have our sustainability, course as well, but it's more about the disclosure side for companies. So and also in research, I also get to bump into some interesting topic around sustainability, and that's why I want to learn more.
Fantastic. Great to have you, Stanley. As I said, we have a lot of experts here, so it's really good to learn from you all. You can lower your hand, Stanley. Peter?
Okay, I'm Peter Shimbry. I'm from film and TV. I'm interested in more than human futures, and putting together a unit in screen studies based on eco cinema. And so I'm more interested in the dissemination of sustainability through popular media.
Fantastic. Thanks, Peter. Mark? We can't hear you, Mark. That's fine. Feel free to pop it in the chat if you can't get your...
Right. Hi, sorry.
Oh, perfect.
I'm a sustainability practitioner working primarily in my own business, Eco-Effective Solutions, in the field of architecture, but also particularly interested in social value and social sustainability.
Lovely. Thanks, Mark. Karen?
Hi, my name is Karen. Could you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Oh, okay. So I'm doing my postgraduate studies at QUT. However, my background was in engineering. I'm particularly interested in the environmental sustainability. I noted, I think it's in this week's module, about just the regulatory way the environment processes over the years. And one of it was the issue of erosion, which caught my eye because I thought about, should we really be implementing the coastal protection measures at all if it's going to impact the coastal processes? So I don't want to talk too much on that, and that's it for me.
That's great. Thanks, Karen. These are really wicked problems, aren't they? Prad, you're next. We can't hear you, Prad. Feel free to type something in the chat if it's easier. And while Prad's typing in the chat, Katrina's said that she's interested in the motivations of people and the actions they take to reduce their footprint. Thanks, Katrina.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry,
Great.
sorry, yeah. I'm Sunil Pradhan, a PhD student in the Faculty of Engineering at Gardens Point, QUT. My research is on social and affordable housing, and I'm interested on sustainability in housing. So yeah,
Fantastic.
that's the thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Anna?
Thank you.
Hi, and thanks for having me. I'm a eGrad, one of the eGrad coordinators, and the units I take, one of them is on collaborate, all of them actually, but collaboration and communication is one of them that we specifically talk about. What you just mentioned, Deanna, is wicked problems. And I think that, and I, try to bring the concepts of environment, etc., into all the units and the modules that I teach, whether it's leadership or whatever, because that responsibility lies across all of us. So that's where I'm coming from in being here with you all today, and also because I have a passion for it, and I think it's really important. And the more I know, the better equipped and the better for me.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Anna. That's really great. Great to have your contributions. Tushenta?
Hello, I'm Dushin. I'm doing Master of Business Process Management at QUT. I'm curious about how to transform business in current business into a sustainable one, and also every department, like for example, human resources, sustainable human resource management to transform HR department. It's like that. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. If we've left anyone out, I see there's 2 new messages. Let me just read those. Raj has messaged saying they're pursuing a PhD at CQU. Welcome, Raj. Research topic is related to sustainability and how technology can help claiming the recycling claim. And June has also messaged to say they're a PhD student at QUT School of Engineering, interested in sustainable approaches in pavement engineering. Judy, you've got your hand up, last but not least.
Sorry, I'm a bit slow.
No,
Hi,
it's
I'm
good.
Judy Matthews from the School of Management, Faculty of Business and Law. I guess I'm really interested in finding ways as a society that we can reduce pollution. And I guess I'm really concerned about, when you look at the statistics, the largest contributors to pollution seem to be construction, both current and past. So I've been looking at what are the possibilities in modern methods of construction in terms of both reducing landfill, but also coming up with some new ways of doing things, more towards the circular economy approach. So I'm really enjoying the whole program so far, Deanna. It's been wonderfully put together. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to contributing in the future. All the best.
Thanks so much, Judy. Yeah, I saw a fantastic story just today about using coffee grounds in construction and constructing concrete. So I'll send that article around to all of you because it's fascinating. Thanks, everyone. And we also have Yasika taking a PhD in the School of Early Childhood and Inclusive Education. Thanks. Welcome, Yasika. So just about me as well, because I'm not sure I've introduced myself fully, just to say, you may be able to tell I'm originally from South Africa. In South Africa, I studied my Masters of Geology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. That was in eThekwini, which is Durban. And I moved on from there into the public understanding of science and earth science education. And then I moved into the UK, moving more broadly into leading university strategic projects and learning and teaching. And sustainability was a key focus of one of these. And at QUT, I've been one of the main curriculum representatives on the Education for Sustainability Working Group for a few years. And I work with academics to embed sustainability in their courses, particularly in ways that make sense for them and their disciplines. I think for me, one of the things that I found striking, which I've seen across the course, is that when I did my geology degree, I don't recall them ever mentioning humans in society, which is a real worry, that a whole kind of, I guess, a whole contingent of students have come through with this very separate view, of the world. So it's really nice to be able to pull it together in this course. So let's move on to our two guest speakers. And while they're chatting, feel free to put comments and queries in the chat as well, which we'll pick up on, or you can wait until the end to ask any questions. It's really fantastic to have two specialists from QUT who are working in this area. And so I'll introduce Professor Rowena Maguire first. Rowena is Professor in the School of Law and Director of the QUT Centre for Justice. And her opening talk is particularly important to us because I think in the opening week, what a lot of us realized is how far sustainability moves beyond merely the environmental, that kind of trifecta of different factors. And that's where Rowena's work in justice comes through so strongly. So Rowena, would you like to get your presentation going? And welcome.
Okay. So I'm hoping everybody can see that and hear me well. Yes. Okay. So thank you for inviting me here today, and great to see the range of expertise that's just in the room here looking at this grand challenge. We really need every type of knowledge at every level to do something about improving environmental and social justice. So I'm the director of the Centre for Justice at QUT. And sorry, just as well, I would also like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations people of the land where QUT now stands, and pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. So with QUT, C4J, which stands for Centre for Justice, this is a centre that is predominantly based, I guess, in the HASS disciplines, so humanities and social sciences. But that means that it is an interdisciplinary centre. So we work with people from across the university. I'm in conversation with Jackie, who's on the call today, about working with the Centre for Resilience. But we're grounded in the social sciences. And I think some of the important things that we focus on is that critical scholarship. So is that scholarship using methodologies to critique and ask why we're doing things at the moment in terms of our policies and our economics, and who's benefiting and whose knowledge gets used to shape these sorts of activities. We are particularly strong in terms of our engagement with industry and the community sector and our translation activities. And so a lot of our research really is focused on, I guess, working in collaboration to solve these problems that individuals may be experiencing, justice issues that individuals may be experiencing as a result of structural injustices. But when we sort of start to talk about structural injustice, that brings us to that kind of global lens of examining how the world works. So just very quickly today, I just wanted to highlight that when we're thinking about environment, as Deanna's just mentioned, often when we say the word environment, it makes us jump straight to thinking about natural systems. But obviously, the impact upon natural systems largely comes from humans. And so we really do need to think of the two together. And so if we think it's sort of the you know, overarching framework at the international level, which is really dealing with sustainability, it is these SDG goals. And I'm sure I don't need to cover these goals in much detail. I'm sure you're all familiar with these goals and you've heard them before, but it's really just to point out that when we look at these goals, we can see things like gender equality, you know, reducing inequalities, which is that social sustainability, but we can also see factors that are really very clearly environmental. So, you know, climate, water, land. So it's really these kinds of two issues that are interconnected. And I think increasingly in my work, I have found that the unintended consequences, for example, of pushing for one type of outcome, which might be a social outcome, can cause environmental implications, just as the same as trying to, for example, take climate action can actually produce unintended social consequences. And so often we need to look at these as connected issues. The other framework that I wanted to just quickly touch on today on this issue of how we connect environmental and social sustainability is the donut economics framework. There's a great video available at this link. It's about 6 minutes on YouTube, which you can watch. But in a summary, this is just a framework that sort of begins to think through how do we actually connect, or how do we actually order our society and in particular our economy to provide for a just and safe space for humanity. And so what we see on the inside of the donut here is really those social issues. And so these are the things that in many countries we still need to improve significantly, particularly in the global south. There is a need for more development, particularly. But what we see around the outer of the donut is really, I guess, the limits of the earth. The sorts of issues that will happen is if we continue to push the levels that we've been pushing at, it will push us into ecological degradation, which will take us into this overshoot into this space. And so the idea of the donut is that basically within this donut ring, we need to be able to meet the needs of all people within a safe ecological framework effectively. And so that is going to require changes in the way that we consume and produce, and it's going to require changes in the way that we view growth. And so this framework in particular is quite critical of seeing gross domestic product as the key factor for measuring progress in society. This framework in particular says that that framework is very dangerous because it doesn't value the work of care, which is, you know, undertaken predominantly by women globally. And it also doesn't undertake the value of the services that are produced by the earth as well. Really interesting, just a very quick introduction. All I would say as well is that there are other frameworks I've just pointed out too quickly to just situate what I'm going to come on and talk about now as well. So in the Centre for Justice, C4J, we have a number of research groups that sit under the centre. And so we have one on modern slavery, one on queer research, which looks at feminist and queer and LGBTQI sorts of research. We've got ones that focused on small islands security governance, and we have one focused on environment and social governance. And the research that I'm going to talk to you about today comes largely out of this environmental and social governance group. And this group in particular are scholars that have been based in the law school, looking really at these sorts of issues. So ESG has become a term that is commonly used within business areas. And so we're going to just begin to explore some of the emerging research that we're doing here. So first up, I thought I'd talk about some of the research I'm doing because that's some of the work I'm the most familiar with. So as you're probably all aware, the fashion industry has got a terrible reputation, both socially and environmentally. So socially, we know that there are instances of modern slavery, child labour and exploitation. There's issues for the women that are working in those workforces as well. What I'm particularly interested in is something that's called, that I'm sort of talking about, which is called supply chain regulation. And so this is regulation that is really, for me, trying to seep into these very complex and opaque global value chains and actually start to regulate what happens in these global value chains. And so examples of this regulation are things like modern slavery. So some of you may have heard of the Modern Slavery Act in Australia or other jurisdictions. And these are pieces of legislation that actually require for reporting upon the labour conditions of those working in certain supply chains. We've got things like circularity schemes. So this is where producers of products have to actually create processes to take back and reuse and recycle and repurpose materials. So we see the emergence of sort of textile, we've seen the emergence of textile or fashion, with basically textile products, producer responsibility schemes. The most established sort of supply chain regulation we have is probably the due diligence regulation that has emerged from the EU recently. And so this is regulation that has strict penalties attached to it for a range of goods to ensure that social and environmental conditions or thresholds are complied with for companies that are earning over a certain amount of money. And products that can't show that they've met these requirements will not be allowed into the EU for sale. So that's a fairly significant reform, really seeking to come in and change the demand for these products. And I think why I find this particular type of regulation exciting is because it's actually tackling consumption. Lots of the other regulation that we've had is really coming back in once we've already caused the problems, whereas I feel like this is starting to get to the root cause. So lots more information about that research at that webpage down there. But some of the projects that we're working on or that I'm working on at the moment include working with the United Nations Environment Program, finishing up a report that is looking at the environmental permitting conditions on fast fashion. So making sure that where the factories are that are producing these clothes are actually complying with water standards, waste management standards, air pollution standards. Chemical management is a huge challenge as well. But more information here. Some of our other researchers are working on frameworks to do with something called One Health. So look, this framework really emerged following COVID-19. And this was really this recognition that, I guess, humans' impacts upon the earth were pushing us into conflict with nature and then potentially leading to the creation of new zoonotic diseases as well. And so One Health is this concept that's really emerged at the WHO, the World Health Organization. And it's a concept that's encouraging scientists, governments, policymakers to not only consider health implications, but actually to recognize that the health of humans is dependent also upon human, animal, and ecosystem health as well. And so we have researchers in our group here, which is Dr. Katie Wollaston, who is working on a pandemic treaty. And so she's been advising the Australian government on this and has been recently at the UN in Nairobi, representing here about what would a pandemic treaty look like. And a pandemic treaty is broader than just thinking about things like COVID-19. It's really underlying this kind of concept of One Health. And then the final case study that I'll talk about today is really this concept of intergenerational equity. And this is, I guess, the idea of the decisions and actions that we take today have ramifications for those coming in the future. So this is really the rights of future generation. And what we are starting to see is a range of climate litigation that is emerging, sort of showing that a range of human rights are implicated by these sorts of issues now. So we've had some fairly significant cases in Queensland, which are borrowing and following on from cases that have been heard overseas, which is really showing that rights to health, housing, food, water, and the cultural rights of First Nation people are actually very badly impacted by climate change and that we need to take more radical action on mitigation. So researchers here, which is predominantly led by Associate Professor Bridget Lewis, is working on the current review of the Queensland Human Rights Act, which was brought in 2019, which is to ensure basically that any piece of legislation introduced in Queensland actually considers human rights. And she's also been very active in leading a number of international, Commonwealth and Queensland policy submissions on these issues as well. And again, details are at that website there. So at C4J, what we sort of have coming up, and all of these things will be available and open to the public, is we have a disaster justice briefing paper series, and Jackie is also contributing. Jackie from the Centre for Resilience is contributing into this. So our briefing paper series are open access, short, accessible, peer-reviewed publications. So what that all means is basically they're free, they're online, and they're trustworthy because they've been through a peer review process. They're about 2,000 words. They're written to be accessible. They're not written in academic jargon. And we have got a special issue coming out on disaster justice. And we've got really a range of fantastic papers there. You can see we've got community resilience. We've got disasters and storytelling for called communities, the impacts of gender and disasters. We're looking at some of the issues that are arising for people in property buyback schemes. We've got disasters in human rights, disasters in displacement, older people and disasters, the role of the school during crises, and in also issues facing Torres Strait Islanders and disasters. So that will all be available shortly at this link down here. We also partner with the EDO, which is known as the Environmental Defenders Office. And every year we hold an annual event, and this year it will be on the 8th of August, where it's their annual fundraising event, but it's usually a debate. It's usually very entertaining. The topic of last year was thank you boomers, to basically, I guess, point the finger at the boomers for the level of ecological destruction that was around. It's done in good nature, but it's a really fun night. If you're in Brisbane and this sounds like fun, I guarantee you it is fun. It's on the 8th of August, and more information will flow on that soon in terms of registration processes. And then the final thing that we're doing this year on this topic is another event which opens up, which is called Doing Justice Differently, and that will be in October 2024, and it's focused on food justice. And I'll finish up now.
Thanks so much, Rowena. That's absolutely fantastic. You've really kind of, I guess, reinforced the kinds of things we've been discussing over the last 3 weeks in our classroom, but also started to build upon that even further. So that's great. I can see some questions starting to come in the chat. We'll save those for afterwards, and I'll introduce Professor Jackie Croak, Professor in Climate, Environment and Sustainability, and QUT Resilience Centre Director, to give her talk now. It's a bit embarrassing that, but it's also fantastic that Jackie is talking about resilience, because I did a search of our entire course, and we barely mentioned resilience at all across our course. And this is because it's a really emerging concept. So it's absolutely fantastic that we have Jackie to take us, I guess, into this next stage of thinking about sustainability. So welcome, Jackie.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks to Rowena for the context, actually. As she said, we form a lot of strong collaborations between both centres, so it was great to have that before this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the centre. Also, I'd just like to pay my respects to the Turrbal and Yuggera people here. I like to show this image because, as I mentioned, I'm a river person, really. This is from the Bundjalung country of the Northern Rivers. But anyway, here we stand and pay our respects to our Indigenous and First Nations people. As Diana mentioned a little bit, she asked me to talk specifically about the concept of resilience, and I'm relatively new to QUT. I've been in the position for a little bit over a year, or 18 months now. And when I arrived, I guess the working title for the new centre, which formed out of two of the other research centres, the Centre for Environment and the Centre for a Waste-Free World, was the Centre for Climate, Environment and Sustainability. And it was a good working title. I just recently returned from Europe, actually, from a position over there, and definitely reinforced the influence of the SDGs in both the regulatory and political sense. I would have to say it would be much more prominent in Europe than it has been since I've come back, even though we see the infographic that Rowena showed, and I'm sure you've seen throughout your course. I'm not quite sure Australia has fully bedded it down yet in a regulatory sense, and Rowena mentioned a couple of the examples there. The other thing that emerged really is this notion of the boxes. Even the concept of the SDGs is illustrated really in boxes, in silos. And we've talked a lot about wicked problems. We've talked a lot about complex systems. And I think if there's one word that we're trying to get at with resilience, it is the notion that we are dealing with very complex adaptive systems. So if you Google what is resilience, it's this notion that, you know, any system, whether that's a forest or a city or an economy or a university, has to deal with change and continue to develop. It's the dealing with the change that resilience is trying to get to. And we know from even something like COVID, for example, that we get these shocks and stressors on a system. We saw at a global level how that affected everything worldwide, basically. You know, we saw economies shut down, we saw air transport shut down, and so on. So it's really about creating something that we know that we can absorb those shocks, but most importantly, that we can adapt and transform. Previously, even though resilience is relatively new, it has been around for decades, it did get tarred with a little bit of the brush of to bounce back. You know, so resilience was that something would happen and then we would bounce back, which, you know, there has been resistance for that. And particularly mentioning First Nation and Indigenous, the notion that we bounce back to what? So I guess new definitions of resilience are much more around innovation and transformation. So it's important that we see, you know, the interdependencies, as we've all talked about, between the humans and obviously the ecological, social and ecological systems. But the critical thing is that we're always working in very complex adaptive systems, which is scary. And this is why we have wicked problems. But I guess it fundamentally starts from things that we've just talked about here, the belief that humans and nature are strongly coupled. We cannot look at the planet today and see what is emerging in terms of climate change and you know, the whole anthropogenic impact on the planet without recognizing the role that humans have played. So this social ecological coupling. One of the reasons that we have complex adaptive systems, and part of the reason that we're grappling to solve them, is we don't think like that. As humans, we think about the, you know, the priorities of humans on the planet. We want to have continued access to clean water, you know, good coastal infrastructure, anything that we might choose. We gave some examples earlier on, whether it's erosion, water quality. We want that, but we don't think about our connection to our own practices and how that impacts on the environment. So it's very much around that interconnectedness and getting us to think in those complex systems, and it's quite challenging. If you were to pick the difference between sustainability and resilience, there's a paper that was published recently in Nature Sustainability. I've put the reference up there, and they did a review of a very large number of studies, actually, and they identified there are 6 pathways that are probably different between, say, sustainability. And it's not that sustainability isn't relevant. That's what we're all aiming for, is still sustainable development. It's just the way that we're choosing to get there is a slightly different way of thinking. So they identified 6 differences, if you like, and I'll just very quickly go through it, but I'd encourage you to maybe have a look at the paper. The first one was that we're moving from capitals to capacities. So rather than thinking about it just in terms of number in households or number of cattle on a paddock, on a farm, or whatever it might be, we're now talking about the capacities of those aspects to sustain us. So it's much more moving away from just numbers, capital markets and things like that into our capacities to sustain ourselves in the future. We're very much moving away from objects. You know, we see, again, we used to talk about whether it's the percentage in reserve, in a biodiversity context, to the relationships between biodiversity loss and land use change or human impact, for example. Number 3 is pretty critical, because I do believe this SDG framework kind of gave us a very closed system. You know, we can't be talking about injustice and equalities and things like that without thinking about the relationship to the other SDGs. The resilience framework is all about open systems. So it's about recognizing that actions in one place can have big impacts in remote locations, for example, that our system is constantly adapting. Very much moving from outcomes to processes. So we used to be sort of driven by blueprints and sustainable practices, for example, without really understanding what was causing it, what was the root cause of some of these, what are the processes that are happening that are going to result in being able to better transform and innovate. If you're thinking about innovation, we need to understand processes a lot better. Number 5 is pretty important as well. We've moved from these generic interventions, everything from, you know, blanket scale reductions of CO2 or specific sustainable development practices, generic, whether that's across Europe or across the globe, to this notion of context sensitivity. And for many of you online here, you have that global perspective of sustainability, and we can talk about the impact in the disproportionate parts of the globe, for example, particularly our nearest neighbours and some of the islands, whether it's Fiji or any of those locations where the impact of our actions is going to be disproportionately felt. So we need to look at that context sensitivity in developing, you know, appropriate solutions and practices. And the final one there is from linear to complex causality. We used to have the notion that if we reduce something, there'll be a proportionate reduction in something else. It was a very linear thinking, whereas now we're talking about there are lots of overlaps in our system that even if we reduce something, there could be feedbacks, both positive and negative feedbacks in the system. And we weren't really traditionally very good at looking at those. So that's just a brief overview. I think it's a really interesting concept. The reason that we chose it for the centre, I guess, was because it's probably more of a workable framework to adapt to this complex system, rather than reacting to things like sea level rise or global temperature rise. We need to have a framework where we can actually start seeing all parts of the system, whether that's human, environmental, social, economic, and how they are interacting. So the aim of the centre, and it's a very new centre, we've only just started really, is to accelerate global resilience. You know, we want to lever the cutting edge research that's happening at QUT and in our university partners, and critically create actionable solutions with partners to build resilient environmental systems and communities. So that's our overarching goal. Rowena mentioned a couple of the frameworks, the Donut Economics and the SDG framework. The other one that you might have come across is the Planetary Boundary Framework of Johan Rockström and colleagues, which has become quite famous at demonstrating these safe operating spaces for the planet in terms of temperature, CO2, ocean acidification. You could put and in fact it has been done, the Donut Economics lays on top of this, and there's been recent iterations of this work which actually includes business. How do we use these frameworks actually for businesses? Because the only framework that we have to be operating in is the safe operating space of the planet. Once we exceed these, we've gone into what are known as tipping points, and in which case we have identified there would be unintended consequences of a fairly large scale. So within the centre, we have 4 programs: climate futures, carbon, conservation, and circularity. And within those, we have 4 missions. So I adopted the Mazzucato policy-orientated mission approach in setting up what would we focus on within the centre. Our first mission really builds on a lot of the advanced technologies, monitoring technologies in particular that QUT has developed a global reputation in. And that is, you know, collecting the baseline data around ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef, biodiversity loss. We have things like acoustic monitoring of species now, so we can understand baseline data, but also how that has changed in space and time. And we want to use this monitoring technologies. We need to move beyond just collecting the data. We now want to use that to accelerate our understanding of these Earth systems and better be able to respond to those complex challenges. Everything that happens in the reef is also a function of what's happening in our catchments, and everything that's happening in terms of biodiversity loss is also a function of land use change and our conversion of large areas for agriculture, which is important for food security. Our second mission is to enable interdisciplinary research to lead the carbon management for social, economic, and environmental co-benefits. And we have a number of members here from business and law, biology and earth and atmospheric sciences, where we're looking to have that interdisciplinary approach around the management of carbon, both its capture and sequestration, but also what we're using it for. Our third mission is building on the work at the Centre for a Waste-Free World, where we want to basically advance the models and systems for resource management. We want to accelerate this transition to a circular economy. So some of the work that Rowena mentioned is certainly has strong collaborations here with some of our members in both waste, but also textiles, landscape architecture, engineering, you name it, the transition to a circular economy. And nature is part of that. We tend not to often think about nature as part of the circular economy, but we need to see it as part of that transition. The final mission is really around promoting the concept of resilience, particularly climate resilience, as something that we can see as very dynamic. You know, we have to be much more adaptive to the inevitable shocks and stresses. I don't think, you know, IPCC reports are telling us where we're sitting right now. It would be naive to say that we're going to be immune to some of these shocks and stresses. We just need to basically have a better understanding how we can adapt, but how we can transform and innovate in light of those. So transformation is the key rather than the notion of bouncing back. It's very much saying, what do we have to transform now, and what innovations can we introduce now to make ourselves much more resilient? Like Rowena's centre, this is an interdisciplinary centre. It's quite a large membership of over 150 QUT researchers. There's no doubt that, you know, unless we work collaboratively, many of our missions will be somewhat half-baked. So I'm really hoping that we do come together across disciplines and membership to create that real-world impact. We have some of the brightest minds here at QUT. We want to lever some of the existing expertise that we got, that we already have, but introduce new areas, particularly through advancing early career researchers, for example, and take advantage of some of the existing technologies to deliver some of these new insights. So I might leave it there and open to any questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That's absolutely fantastic. Right, now we're going to hand over to our wonderful students to ask questions. Sulashana, you put a question in the chat. Would you like to ask that yourself, or would you like me to just talk about it regarding modern slavery? I'll just ask then. It was a question in Rowena's talk around, is the modern slavery statement mandatory or a voluntary requirement in Australia? And I think it also then connects to what Jackie was saying about regulations worldwide kind of not tracking with each other.
Yeah, so it's a mandatory regulation for companies with $100 million plus turnover. So it doesn't capture all companies, it's capturing the larger companies. But what I would say for the modern slavery regulation is that it's a type of regulation known as disclosure regulation. So the idea of disclosure regulation is this idea that it improves corporate social responsibility by requiring business to reflect on their actions and report upon them and disclose those actions. But at the moment, the Act does lack strong enforcement mechanisms or really anything to ensure that the company is doing something to sort of improve their behaviour.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I mean, I guess the following question is, when might it kind of be for smaller companies, and might we ever dare to hope that it will be for smaller concerns?
It is looking to be expanded, but some of the other things that they're trying to bring in is some sort of strengthening up of the obligations of reporting to ensure that the data is verified, so that what they're reporting is in some way verified. So it's very slow steps. Like it's that we know what the problems are, but getting those reforms through is tricky. So yeah, the next lot of reforms is trying to ensure that at least the data that's reported is of a similar nature and is verifiable. Yeah.
Great, thanks. There's a question to you, Jackie, from Prad about, well, firstly saying thank you for an insightful and thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. How we can transition from a workable framework to complex systems approach in sustainability, and what strategies can we use to ensure that holistic and adaptive management, given that so many of these things are recorded in their boxes and silos?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Prad. I'm not sure I have a total answer here, but I think there's a couple of things from my personal opinion. One would be to start thinking, to start teaching systems thinking, actually. It's generally absent, I think, from sustainability work in general. When I was in my role back in Dublin, we introduced a sustainability degree, actually, which had 3 pillars from science and engineering, business and law, and economics and business. And one of the things that we had the opportunity to do right from the start was actually to embed systems thinking in the modules, so that students coming in had a very good understanding of feedback loops, for example, how if you change transport routes, by putting in a particular road development, what does that do to communities? What is that doing to CO2 emissions and so forth? It does drive students insane because it does illustrate just the complex nature. But I think unless you're actually starting to train future sustainability leaders in systems thinking, it's very difficult to retrofit it. That's my personal view. Somebody that's been working in sort of earth system science for many, many years, it's hard to get your head around unless you kind of start from those fundamentals. So that would be the first. I think for businesses, obviously our economy is very linear. We're still driven predominantly by capital growth, the notion that the more that we acquire, the better the future will be. It's a very linear thinking. Circular models, the donut model is a case in point, but we're nowhere near sort of thinking in terms of the economy to support a circular economy, if you like, that transition. So I think in terms of business and law students, again, having an opportunity to think about what that would look like. The resilience framework itself is a framework. It's not perfect by any means, and indeed it has been around for decades. And one of the barriers it faces is it's still trying to shed the notion of bouncing back, I think. So we're still trying to work out, well, if it's transformation, where are we transforming to and things. So it's really a very different, it's a paradigm shift in our thinking. So I hope that provides some answer, but we need everybody kind of committed to that thinking, I think, as a start.
Thank you. That's great. Everyone, please keep your questions going in the chat if you have any, but otherwise I'm going to start questioning because I'd like to follow on from that one about everybody having a part to play, Jackie, because across the few weeks that we've been discussing things, there's been a real tension between the kind of individual versus collective interests. And, some people have gone so far as to frame it as selfishness and narcissism and kind of, I guess, outright greed. And sometimes that's applied in terms of how we talk about corporate bodies. But I think, how do we move on from that? Because there was also the view that the everyday person, I suppose, in the street doesn't warm to these kinds of issues unless they can see the impacts on themselves and their own lives. So how do we kind of move beyond the kind of selfishness, I guess, and thinking only about oneself? That's a question to both of you, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess Rowena will have a lot to add here. I guess my background has really been in STEM, and I must admit, I probably went into it because I was much more comfortable dealing with nature than I was with humans. I suspect that you'll find that might be a common pattern. But as I've developed in my career, I have realized that actually the future of the planet is we cannot solve these wicked problems and these complex challenges without understanding human psychology and what motivates and drives people. One of the Centre for Excellences at UNSW, for example, that was entirely STEM-based around climate extremes, was only renewed if it added psychology, actually, in its next phase. And I thought that was a really interesting insight to where most people recognize the gap is now understanding human behavior. Do I have an understanding of what that is? It's been very frustrating for me looking at it because sometimes it seems obvious. I will say, having moved, as I said, from Europe, a regulatory framework, regardless of what we say, makes that a lot easier. A common, consistent definition of the trajectory that we want, and that we basically make that regulatory, definitely lays a foundation that's easier to get us to a point that may not always be necessary. But I think in the first instance, given where we sit right now in terms of some of those planetary boundaries and our desire to keep global temperatures down, I do believe that politics and regulatory frameworks play a greater role than we're potentially acknowledging here. I'll pass it to Rowena because I do think that, Rowena's experiences in the line of justice will probably have more value there.
Thanks.
I think, I guess my only reflection would be is that quite often when we've sort of thought about the responsibility for sustainability, there has been a tendency to push it to the individual. So if we take waste management, for example, the tendency has been generally to push that down to the household level, to deal with sorting and then to deal with, for example, taking batteries to one place and, other products. And so it's all pushed down to the individual. And I think instead, if we were looking at structural changes, which is instead then sort of moving more towards the circular economy, that would really be requiring changes at that regulation that requires industry and corporate bodies to share that responsibility. So I don't think it's only a responsibility for corporations, but I do think that the balance at the moment is to push that responsibility down onto the individual. And therefore, the person that is responsible for the action is the individual who can't change the structural overconsumption and production, but can only deal with them at that household level. Saying that, I think that, you know, psychology and other things is going to show that there's huge benefits from engaging in more sustainable practices in your everyday life. And there are huge benefits for that on an individual level and in a school level and things, but we have to recognise the limitations of that as well in terms of addressing those bigger structural issues around consumption and production.
Thanks, Rowena. Yes, in terms of structural issues, there's a question from Karen, and it kind of relates to your discussion around unintended consequences and seeing things as a whole. Karen's asking about how we prioritise the different bits of the models, for example, in coastal protection measures, where Karen's interest lies around, you know, do we look at regulatory environmental processes of erosion, or do we actually kind of do something else to let coastal processes occur more naturally? How do we balance up all of those multiple things, I guess, in those models?
On coastal processes, I might let Jackie answer the question, if that's okay, Jackie.
Yeah, no worries. I think, Karen, you know, whether it's coastal or catchment, it comes back to my belief that we need to understand the system. You know, at the moment we talk about coastal, we talk about oceans actually separate from terrestrial systems, when in fact they're highly connected. So everything that's happening in our oceans is a function of what's happening on land in the planet. So I think the first step is actually to see that, to enhance that interconnectedness. And there's been a lot of work done in that space. If you take the Great Barrier Reef catchments, for example, you know, part of the health of the reef is intimately connected to what's happening in those catchments. Now, that's taken decades of community engagement, stakeholder workshops, buy-in to try and get, you know, individual sectors, whether it's agriculture or grazing, to see the impacts that their practices were having on the health of the Great Barrier Reef. It's exactly the same with coastal processes. We've seen massive urban development in our coastal zone area in Australia for many, many decades. And now with the advent of coastal erosion, we've seen massive insurance claims with respect to houses falling in or being structurally undermined due to coastal erosion. If you think in a system, you're constantly looking at where the impact of one process or consequence is actually going to have that feedback where the positive or negative is. So if we could get planners, engineers, you know, national parks, you name it, thinking around feedback loops and of trying to look at where these unintended consequences are, I think that it would be a lot easier. That said, because all of these organizations are in silos, it's really about the breakdown of those silos.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Judy has asked and observed, really, particularly in terms of circularity and regulation, the EU and the OECD seem to be a bit more ahead than ours. And I guess the question is, how might we advance the understandings and practices in Australia more quickly?
It's a good question, Judy. I think the key for us, I think what's in our favour is that we have created these really complex global value chains. And so we will have a commodity grown in one region of the world, which might be sent somewhere else for processing and then might ultimately be shipped to 2 other places before the product is then sold as a good somewhere. So as a result of those complex global value chains, we've had a lot of failure to take responsibility in the past for social and environmental issues here. But I think that the fact that we've got a country or a region like the EU, who is a large region, beginning to install these kinds of regulations, industry is concerned about these sorts of issues. Industry is watching what is happening in the EU and wondering where else it is going to happen in other regions. So I actually think that trade law, of all things, is actually the thing that will actually drive better practices here, because it's going to be actually ensuring that these goods meet these requirements. So I think that it's this idea of trying to lift the bar in Europe, and then that has ramifications beyond Europe. So it has this extraterritorial impact of those sorts of reforms. And And yeah, so that's my answer there. And then I was just going to say that I think we had a comment about greenwashing, and I think that that's a really, really important point to note as well, that we have to be very careful of greenwashing. So again, the EU has created some really good legislation around greenwashing and making of claims that are not trustworthy or reliable. We've had the Senate inquiry into Australia into greenwashing. A number of those claims were concerned with sort of sustainability, related issues of many companies. And it is an ongoing and real challenge. In the Australian context, one of the biggest issues is that the current body responsible for investigating greenwashing has no budget or resources to do so. So the ACCC, Australian Consumer, and I don't remember the proper acronym, but it's the ACCC, actually doesn't have the capacity to possibly monitor all of the greenwashing at the moment. So if we are going to be serious about it, that is one real challenge at the moment, that you can report the issue, but there's no one to take up implementation.
Thanks, Rowena. I'm so glad you picked up on the greenwashing to take us all into a downer as well. No, it's really important. It's a really important point. We only have a few minutes left, so I think we won't ask for any more questions from the cohort, but to end on an upper, I suppose, my question is about hope. Jackie, I think you had the word hope written in your slides, but really, there's a lot of climate anxiety and a lot of people feel pretty miserable about this. There's a lot of disinformation, misinformation out there. Where's the hope in all of this? How do people in this cohort feel positive about this? Jackie and Rowena, any responses to that?
Yeah, I think it's true. I have 3 daughters myself, and I guess it's easy to feel overwhelmed in this. And certainly as people who work in this on a day-to-day basis, it is easy to lose faith. I do also believe that there is enormous hope. I do believe that our undergraduates, our school children, if you go into a primary school or a secondary school where they have a sustainability program, they're enormously proud of that. I think our undergraduates at QUT would also be the same. I think hope is innate in human beings, to be honest, and I would hate to imagine a future where we would lose that completely. But I think it's important in terms of one of the attendees is there as part of cinema translation. Typically, we've used the sort of doom and gloom to shock people into action. I think we need to transition now into hope. There's just as many positive stories. In terms of tipping points, for example, we've moved into a tipping point of there's now more electric vehicles on the planet than there ever was. There are good news stories, and I think that's part of the translation of what's happening. Definitely appeal to people, don't lose hope, because even individual practices, particularly individual practices, can give meaning beyond what we might feel in any given moment.
That's great. Thank you. Rowena, final point?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I teach the undergraduate course at QUT on environmental law, and I'm usually so busy getting so fired up and angry about how bad our laws are that I sometimes forget that maybe it's depressing the students. And so one year I actually sort of realized that we needed to bring hope into the course. And so one of my PhD students, she's fantastic. She works for Psychology for a Safe Climate, and she's actually written a fantastic piece basically on hope and the environmental crisis. Her name's Monica Taylor, and she begins to unpack some of the psychology of hope as well and why it is important. But for me, the key takeaway from that is that hope is the opposite of inaction, and so hope is the action to keep doing something. Hope is the belief that you can change things. Hope is getting more information and knowledge, and hope is actually making and taking steps and changes in your life. And that's how you actually acquire hope. And so, yeah, I found that to be pretty powerful. So my general reaction, rather than despair, is anger. And apparently that's healthy. So I was relieved to read that.
Thank you. That is such a fantastic set of points to end on in terms of hope. So I'll transcribe all of those for the cohort as well, and I'll also get that reference from you, if you don't mind, from Monica that she's written. I think that's about all we've got time for. We will have copies of the presentations for you available as downloads, I think, from the presenters, if they're okay with that. But we really like to thank all of you for coming along. We wouldn't have a session without all of the conversation and discussion. Huge thanks to our guest presenters, Jackie and Rowena. It's been amazing to have your expertise and just so lovely to open up the conversation some more. Thanks to Ola from the Graduate Research Office as well for setting this all up. These things don't happen by magic. And most importantly, just to end off and say thank you to all of you in the cohort for participating. And we'll see you in the online classroom in the next few weeks. Really great. Thank you. Bye, everyone.